Good morning. This is the final day of the STS 56th annual meeting, and we have another great day in store for you. Please remember to silence your cell phones and other devices during presentations. Before we get started, I'd like to make an announcement about some of the developments of the STS members business meeting last evening. The STS Distinguished Service Awards were presented this year to two very deserving candidates and/or recipients, Dr. Bob Cormos and Rob Winbrand. A member since 1989, Dr. Cormos served in many capacities at the STS, including as chair of the STS Intermax Database Task Force and as a member of the Society's workforce on national databases. Dr. Cormos, and internationally recognized for his clinical research work and mechanical circulatory support efforts, his expertise played a critical role in the Society's decision to add Intermax to the STS national database. Throughout his career, over 40 years, he had an exceptional record of patient care, delivering superior outcomes, and successfully translating mechanical circulatory support technologies into clinical and commercial applications. During that time, he demonstrated the expertise in building teams and collaborating with clinicians and industry to develop innovations. Few of our volunteers had the time, energy, and sweat invested in the STS mission. Dr. Cormos is currently the Division Vice President for Global Medical Affairs for Heart Failure at Abbott Labs in Austin, Texas, and a Professor Emeritus of the Cardiothoracic Surgery Program at the University of Pittsburgh. Rob Winbrand, of course, needs no introduction to most people in the audience. He diligently worked behind the scenes and up front for over 30 years at the STS. He garnered a deep respect by his colleagues for his dedication and sharp intellect. As our outside legal counsel, he formed a profound knowledge about the STS and the cardiothoracic surgery profession, establishing a reputation for being very thorough and extremely detail-oriented. As our Chief Administrative Officer, he impressively championed growth, communicated regularly and powerfully, and was a significant and positive influence. He ultimately ended up helping us develop a plan and execution of every step of every major initiative the Society undertook during his tenure. That included the launch of the database, creation of our charitable organization known as the Thoracic Surgery Foundation, the STS PAC, transitioning to self-management, and significant growth of our membership. These were extraordinary accomplishments in addition to our financial stability. Last year, he retired from his full-time executive director and general counsel role, but this legacy will be a long-lasting recognition. They both received these on behalf of the Society, and we want to honor them and please recognize them as Distinguished Service Awardees, Dr. Bob Cormos and Rob Winbrand. Also last night at the business meeting, officers and director elections were held. New members of our board include Directors at Large Gregory Fontana from Thousand Oaks, California, Jim Tweddle from Cincinnati, Ohio, and Jennifer Romano from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Our new public director is Roger Newton from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Joe Cleveland from Aurora, Colorado was also reelected as a director at large. And we also reelected Domenico Pagano from Birmingham, United Kingdom, as our international director. Mark Rule from Ottawa, Canada, as our Canadian director. Alec Patterson from St. Louis as the editor of the Annals for another 5 years. Tom McGilvery as the treasurer from Houston, and Joe Sabick as secretary from Cleveland. John Calhoun from San Antonio, Texas, was elected as the new second vice president. So please join me in recognizing those nominees and contributors to the Society. In the leadership projection, of course, will be Sean Grondin from Calgary, Canada, who was elected as the new first vice president of the STS. And the Society's new president is Dr. Joe Duraney from Rochester, Minnesota. Congratulations, Joe and Sean, on your nomination and election. It's now time to present today's awards. But before we do that, we'd like to inform you about the Jeopardy winner from Sunday evening and our poster winners who were also chosen Sunday. The Jeopardy winners were the University of Michigan, Curtis Berquist, and Alex Brescia, members of that team. I don't know if they're here, but please give them a round of applause. Our poster winners include adult cardiac surgery, Samir Hirji; in congenital, Philip Allen; for general thoracic, Miniam Kindane; and for quality improvement, Jennifer Berg. Please give them a round of applause. Today's first award is the 2020 President's Award. It's for an outstanding paper presented by a resident or a surgeon 5 years or less in practice. This award was made possible through the generosity of the past president, Doug Mathieson, and the Massachusetts General Hospital. This year's award goes to Dr. Armin Killick from the University of Pittsburgh for his paper, Performance of a Machine Learning Algorithm in Predicting Outcomes After Surgical Aortic Valve Replacement, an analysis of the STS National Database. Please recognize Dr. Killick. I don't know if he's here to accept the award, but we certainly, come on. Great. Congratulations, Armin. At this time, I'd like to ask the President of the Thoracic Surgery Directors Association to come forward, Dr. Ara Vaporshian, and he'll present the TSDA Benson R. Wilcox Award.
Thanks, Bob. The Benson Wilcox Award was established for Dr. Benson Wilcox, who for 29 years led the University of North Carolina Cardiac Division and thoracic surgery, and also was quite dedicated to thoracic surgical education. He was the leader of the TSDA and really one of the co-founders of the TSDA, and led it from 1985 to 1987. In addition, in 2009, 1 year before his death, unfortunately, the TSDA established the Benson Wilcox Award, which is to acknowledge the best scientific abstract presented by a cardiothoracic surgery resident at the Society of Thoracic Surgery meeting. And this award has been going on now for 10 years. It's actually my pleasure now to introduce the award winner, who is Dr. Zhu, for her work on bilateral single internal mammary artery grafts for coronary bypass surgery in the United States, a study of over 1 million patients. And what's uniquely impressive about Dr. Zhu is not only the fact that she's a third-year resident at Stanford in their I-6 program and is excelling phenomenally, but she was also a Looking to the Future award winner 5 years ago, a program that Dr. Higgins mentioned previously in his address yesterday. And it's wonderful to see that we're finding the best and the brightest, we're securing them at an early age, bringing them on board, and then making them an award winner for us. So please help me congratulate Dr. Zhu.
Thank you. Congratulations. I'd now like to call forward Dr. Alex Brescia of the Thoracic Surgery Residents Association to present faculty awards and fellowship awards. Alex? No, I think you are. I believe Alex is going to present the award. Go ahead. the Socrates Award, right? Yeah.
All right, so I'm happy to present the Socrates Award to Dr. David Campbell from the University of Colorado.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Gosh, there's so many people to thank, but I'd like to start by saying that I've had really two wonderful mentors in my life, one who's in the audience, but the other is Dr. Aldo Castaneda and Dr. Alden Harkin. And they've been my inspiration throughout my career. They're tremendous surgical educators. They're loved and cherished by every single one of their residents, fellows, and junior faculty, and myself included. And I could never thank them enough for what they've done for me in my life. But even more than that, it's been an honor and a privilege to be able to work with so many wonderful residents and fellows throughout my 40-plus year career. They've made my life quite enjoyable, and they are our life's blood for this institution. So again, it's been a wonderful time for me to be involved with the residents and education. Thank you.
Great.
And the TSRA Socrates Award that Dr. Campbell just received is voted on by faculty and residents as for the outstanding surgical educator. Thanks, Dr. Campbell. Our next award is the TSRA Magoon Award. This is voted on by residents for an outstanding young faculty member in the area of education. I'm happy to announce this year's recipient is Dr. Natalie Louis from Stanford University. Next award is the TSRA STS Traveling Fellowship. This will be the 6th year of the fellowship, where a trainee from North America will visit another center for 1 to 2 weeks. And happy to announce this year's winner is Dr. Chetan Pasrija from the University of Maryland, who will be going to the University of Toronto to work on lung transplantation with Dr. Kashavi. And then our final award, we have the TSRA STS Global Outreach Fellowship. And this is the 2nd annual awarding of this fellowship. The winner this year is Claudine Lewis from the University of Rochester, who will be working at CardioStart International with Dr. Aubin Merith to provide access to cardiac surgery for those in need. Come on up, Claudine.
It really is great to see the recognition by our residents and our faculty for great educational activities. It's now my honor to announce the Earl Bakken Scientific Achievement Award, which is sponsored by Medtronic, our extraordinary partner, named for their company's founder. The Bakken Award was established by Medtronic in 1999 to recognize leaders in our profession who have made outstanding scientific contributions that have not only enhanced the practice of cardiothoracic surgery, but have improved the quality of life for our patients. This is an award, and it's a prestigious award, and this year's recipient is especially worthy of our recognition. It was his vision, passion, and innovative spirit that helped launch a new era of heart transplantation in the 1980s. And his pioneering surgical techniques have helped thousands of patients worldwide. Our awardee was fascinated by science at a very early age, entering the Cairo University School of Medicine in the early 1950s on a full scholarship as a very young person. His career trajectory towards surgery was inspired by his father and his uncles, who were surgeons in Egypt. But even more significant was the experience of losing an aunt to a heart condition that would have been treated preventably with latest surgical techniques if they had been available. After completing medical school and his surgical residencies, our awardee continued his training in London and then Chicago. He later moved back to London, where he transformed a small, specialty-focused hospital into the largest cardiothoracic surgical transplant program in Europe. He and his team introduced advanced innovations such as heterotopic piggyback hearts and domino heart-lung procedures. He also helped modernize the arterial switch operation and the mustard procedures, as well as develop the freestanding root operations and the first technique for valve-sparing root replacement. In addition to these accomplishments, he generously shared his experiences with students and surgeons from around the world, and has been recognized with a British knighthood, the Order of Merit, and several honorary degrees. He is the founder and president of the Chain of Hope charity, which treats children with correctable heart conditions from underserved countries. He currently is a professor of cardiothoracic surgery at the National Heart and Lung Institute at the Imperial College of London, and the director of the research at the Harefield Heart Science Center, where he oversees more than 60 scientists and students in areas of tissue engineering, myocardial regeneration, stem cell biology, end-stage heart failure, and transplant immunology. For all of his contributions to our scientific advancement of our specialty and in medicine in general, please join me in warmly congratulating Sir Magdi Yacoub as the 2020 recipient of the Earl Bakken Scientific Achievement Award. I'd also like to ask Dr. John Mack, Vice President and General Manager of the Medtronic Cardiac Surgery Program, to join us on the stage.
Thank you very much. I'm truly humbled by receiving this award for more than one reason. Remembering the legacy of Earl Bakken, who have been a role model for many, many generations of people. And more, it is the recognition from this distinguished society, from my colleagues, and I really am humbled and will, even at my old age, will continue to live by the values of this society. Thank you, Dr. Griffith.
Congratulations to Dr. Yacoub, and thanks again to Medtronic for its continuing support of this award. It's now my honor to introduce the Lilly High Lectureship. The Lilly High Lectureship was launched in 2009 through a generous gift from the Lilly High family and charitable foundation in honor of Dr. C. Walton Lilly High. Known as the King of Hearts, Dr. Lilly High was a pioneer in open heart surgery utilizing cross circulation. With us today in the audience, representing the Lilly High family, are his nephew, Dr. Ted Lilly High, who is an STS member and president of the Lilly High Surgical Society, and Ted's wife, Jennifer. The Society acknowledges the thanks of the Lilly High family for endowing this important lectureship. Please thank them for us. This year's Lilly High lecture will be given by Dr. Bartley Griffith, a surgical pioneer, a mentor, and a friend of the Society and of cardiothoracic surgery. He may be best known for his double lung transplantations and implantation of the Jarvik artificial heart. He is a professor of surgery at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, specializing in adult cardiac surgery, coronary revascularization, and heart reconstruction. Dr. Griffith's research interests are on heart and lung transplantation, cell transplantation, and advancing the use of artificial organs. Over his career, he has directed more than 1,200 heart transplants and 600 lung transplants. And he is an innovator in the use of immunosuppression after transplantation and mechanical pumps prior to transplantation. He is the founding director of an internationally recognized McGowan Center for Artificial Organ Development. He is a Heart, Lung, Blood, and National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute investigator and is currently developing an artificial lung, which I'm sure we'll learn more about today. Bart is a great friend, an ally, and a longtime mentor. It really is my honor and my privilege to introduce Dr. Bart Griffith as this year's C. Walton Lilly High lecturer. Thank you, Bart.
Thank you, and thank you, Lilly High family, for giving me an opportunity to address this prestigious group. Bob, thank you for giving me a call a few months ago to tell me your wishes that I be here today, and I was, as was Dr. Yakub, humbled by your invitation. So those of you assembled, I have a pretty easy task, and it's kind of a blast. I recognize that this would be a diverse audience and one that might not necessarily have lived through some of the slings and arrows of mechanical circulatory support development and the development of artificial respiration. So I've adjusted my talk accordingly, hopefully to entertain. If I inform, then that's good. And even if I offend, that might even be better. It's hard to know. But again, thank you. The first part, I'm going to actually read from some remarks to keep me online, because I think it's important to set the stage for the whole topic of the development of these important things, which really made what we do every day in our operating rooms possible. So March 25th, 1954, Gregory Glidden was a malnourished 5-kilogram 5-year-old with a VSD, 1-year-old with a VSD. He had been admitted to the hospital for the 6th time in his first year of life. He suffered with recurrent pneumonia to his left lung, heart failure, and empathy-engendering cachexia. His 2 referring cardiologists believed he would not survive the admission without surgery for his VSD. Cecil Watson, MD, and Erwin McQuarrie, MD, sought out the hospital administrator to demand that the rumored cross-circulation operation planned for later the following day be canceled. The chief of medicine and of pediatrics, respectively, were distinguished physicians. They had a lot of clout. They had lost 2 children operated upon earlier by Clarence Dennis in 1951, who had used an early prototype of an heart-lung machine. They quoted the abysmal tally of 14 of 15 attempts died when a heart-lung apparatus was used to control congenital heart disease. They were horrified by the junior surgeon's intention to use the child's father as a human oxygenator. While the internal concerns swirled around the University of Minnesota, the outside view was not really very much better. Willis Potts, the well-known and respected University of Chicago heart surgeon, had visited Lily High's dog lab earlier. And while presiding as a visiting lecturer, he had time to comment after an experiment that he had seen. He said to Lily High, who was in the audience of the lectureship, "Your name is going to go down in history." Lily High had a little quicker pulse with that because he expected a little affirmation. But Willis continued, and the oft-used phrase was quoted for the first time. "Yes, as the first surgeon to do an operation with a 200% mortality." On the evening of the 24th, Lily High returned to his office after a late afternoon surgery. He found a note on freehand from his surgical chief, O.H. Wagenstein. "Dear Walt, by all means, go ahead. Good luck." Those were the days. The OR was packed the next morning on March 26th. It included 4 anesthesiologists, 3 surgical residents. Maury Cohen, who had conceived of the dog experiments, regulated the flow using a Sigma pump at 40 milliliters per kilogram, or only 200 mLs per minute, to and from the donor lung patient. Herb Warren made groin connection to the father, and Richard Vaccaro connected the child's open chest. CW had trained for the anatomy in Jesse Edwards' pathology lab. He made a 2.5 centimeter incision, not very big, in the overstretched right ventricle. He was met with darkness and obscuring blood. He explored digitally at first without knowing. He found what he was searching for, and he sewed it up as if he were closing a skin wound. The heart closing followed. Maury Cohen stopped the pump, and the time froze, 19 minutes. There were no monitors or ventilators in the early ICUs. The child recovered as if he had had a hernia repair. The only concession in his discharge from the operating room to the pediatric floor directly was that a room be found remote from the nurse's station, chosen for its quietness. Gregory seemed to progress pretty well, but then on the 9th day, he became sick again from his relapsing pneumonia and passed away on the 10th day. This remarkable surgeon that we honor this morning performed 45 cross surgeries over the next 16 months. 28 or 62% left the hospital, and remarkably, 22 or nearly 50% were alive 30 years later. One parent, a mother, had a cardiac arrest during one of the procedures. Dr. Lily High quickly moved to her side, opened her chest, and gave her open cardiac massage. He was quite ahead of his time. She recovered fully. It's quite a message for us to reflect on, and I probably ought to sit down now. But I have more to say. I've entitled my talk, Bumper Car Innovation, Gizmos, and for Mechanical Support and Artificial Respiration. If you read the sign, it says, if you are this tall, you can ride on this ride. And believe me, the rich personalities and wonderful surgeons that you can read about, and I will try to recreate in some small portion today, were quite tall in their own stature. The interesting part about this, in my mind, was that as these events transpired, it seemed to me like they were on bumper cars because the outcomes were never really understood, and in many respects, two different surgeons with different techniques oftentimes ran into each other, and the results sometimes were uncalculable. On the lung side, however, we had a much calmer approach, and I don't know why, but it seemed like those pursuing artificial respiration were tethered to one another and always made the lap. They were less chaotic in the appearance of the progress. It may be just the nature of developing an ECMO machine or a ventilator is a little different than exploring digitally while a mother's lung is supporting the baby. Two events happened in my life. This was one of them in 1985 when we were able in Pittsburgh to replace a heart with a Jarvik 7 total artificial heart. I was pretty young then, and this was a first big step off for me in the operating room. I don't ever see a difficult case where I don't remember the sound of the empty chest and the galloping heart of the mechanical device. I think we all are still looking forward to where that will take us, and I have some comments in a moment about that. The second case relevant to my talk today is this young man who grew up to work in my research laboratory. He's a scratch golfer and was at the time the longest baby supported on ECMO, 1978, for meconium aspiration to survive. These two cases are the origin of my career. So where are we riding to this morning, and in my mind, in the next decade or so with respect to mechanical hearts and lungs? I think we're going to see big advances in that holy grail of cardiac replacement. Work going on in Houston under the direction of Bud Frazier seems to be getting it right. I look forward to the Bivacor device, which is small, it's continuous flow, and it has a pulsatility to it that's undistinguishable from the human heart. Hopefully those trials will get us to clinical use soon. I think the work that we accomplished in the pediatric ventricular assist device development proved that we can develop really small pumps that can offload the heart at 2 liters per minute, and that we will find lower degrees of heart failure suitable to treat either from the left atrium or the left ventricle with these smaller pumps, which will find their place almost as easy to implant as a pacemaker. Lungs, well, I've got my own thing about that. I think we're going home with artificial lungs in the next few years. I think we will perhaps need a major innovation in terms of how we oxygenate with respect to membrane use, but I think we will begin the same kind of course that the early ventricular assist devices did, going home with paracorporeal devices, ultimately setting the stage for big developments in intracorporeal implantations. But we will get the breathless home, and there's not a more compassionate need group of patients that we don't address very well. Well, now saying all this, one of the key things that I kept coming up with in preparing these talks today was that sometimes we overpromise. And maybe that's what keeps us going. We have big personalities in this field, and we like to think success is around the corner. So sometimes we have the feeling we see or hear something that isn't quite the way it turns out. So accordingly, I'd like you to listen, as you did to the artificial heart, this time to those of you that like Ferraris. Things don't always work out as you might have thought. Yeah, that's a good one. Anyhow. So we begin. Intracardiac surgery needed a pump lung, and the story begins. Cooley and Lillihei. In 1955, at the AATS meeting in Houston, where Cooley was attending, Lillihei presented his experience with intracardiac surgery using a parent and a patient. In June 55, he traveled a few months later with his pediatric chief of cardiology by train to Minneapolis. Imagine that, taking a train. Well, it'll take a few days, we'll go up there and whatever. After watching across circulation, which was quite colorful, in part because of a good time was had by a number of people the evening before. The operation went smoothly enough, although Cooley said he had serious concerns for both the patient and the donor. The following day, Dr. Cooley and Dr. McNamara went down the road to visit John Kirkland, who was pioneering with the Mayo version of the Gibbon machine. We saw a very complex machine operated by a staff of technicians who were very skilled. Kirkland successfully repaired the VSD. On the way home, McNamara told Cooley, "You will not operate on any of my patients without such a machine." Well, that sounded all well and good, but Dr. Cooley, and if you knew him, he was a frugal man, and he knew that his institution was not going to pay the $50,000 to $100,000 necessary to obtain a Gibbon machine. The Gibbon machine was quite complex. It required extensive cleaning between uses and 5 liters of fresh blood every time. Imagine. What Cooley had not been told by Lilly was that he had gone to the laboratory the preceding year to begin developing his own version of an oxygenator. He realized that he would not be able to continue cross-circulation indefinitely and that it was impractical for many. So he convinced a young resident, Richard DeWall, to go to the laboratory to develop a simple heart-lung machine. He did so by going a different direction than the screen oxygenators in that he would directly use bubbles into the blood to cause oxygenation. Well, as you know, the bubbles sometimes go through the blood and end up in the brain, and that was one of the reasons that most surgeons had discarded this as a potential problem solver. But these guys figured it out. As you can see here, there's nothing like, a fish aquarium stone. They didn't use that. They used needles in a cork at the base of, let me see how I point this. I don't know if there's a pointer. At the base of that column, which you see oxygen, there is a cork, a bunch of needles, and oxygen. And actually, the size of the bubbles was very, very important, and they worked hard to get it right. The bubbles would flow up into that thing called a debubbling cylinder. If you bubble into oxygen, you create foam. It's a rich milkshake of foam and needed to be dealt with. Until the doctors working at Fellows Institute 2 years previously came up with silicone as a defoaming agent, this would have been impossible to quiet down this fluid. So it was defoamed in that chamber, and then the bubbles were permitted to slowly rise as they tumbled down this helix of 6-foot-long tubing before it was returned by sigma motor back to the patient. Cooley said, "How much?" Walt said, $50 ought to do it. So Dr. Cooley was thinking $50, $100,000, 5 liters of blood, a team of very skilled people that would have to take care of this. He chose Lilly's device, and he took it to the laboratory. Well, those of you who knew Dr. Cooley, he didn't spend a lot of time in the laboratory. It wasn't his forte. And they couldn't get dogs to survive using the pump lung machine. But he was convinced by Lilly that it would work, and a case came to pass presenting itself with no hope for survival without operating. Cooley decided to go ahead, a theme that we will hear about again. So he urgently repaired a VSD ruptured using the DeWalt Lilly oxygenator. He had an early and surprising success. Bingo. The referrals flowed. He did 95 cases in the rest of the year and 107 the year following. There were only 18 deaths of that first 95. Incredible, because most other best surgeons were only accomplishing 50% survivals. I looked to find out some of the people on this paper in the annals, and Dr. Sidney Snur didn't come up in any of the surgical references that I could find. And then I learned that Sidney had referred the patient to Dr. Cooley. Another major teaching Dr. Cooley told us about the referring physician. Get a patient, write a paper, put him on it. This is an operated note kindly made available to me by Bud. It says Denton Cooley, MD, 7/23/57. Diagnosis, atrial septal defect, pre and post. Procedure, closure of the defect, cardiopulmonary bypass, pump oxygenator. Just sounds like today, doesn't it? A few things different. The vital statistics. The flow rate was 35 cc's per kilogram per minute. Time dependent on the pump, 6 minutes. Dr. Cooley was noted to say, you know, as soon as they go on the heart and lung, they begin to die. Much of his success was because he was so fast. In 1957, Vince Gott, working in Minnesota, again under the influence of Lilly High, got together with Travenol, and they developed a commercial equivalent of what appeared to be a pretty clunky heart-lung machine that could be purchased, you know, for parts for $50. So this machine, let's go back. I don't know whether we can start that or not. Can you start that? Well, that's a movie. If you can start it for me, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Heart-lung machines would be pumping blood in operating
So that machine was just a version of the Lilly High machine that I've showed you. It came in a little sandwich. It was called, you know, an envelope oxygenator, but it had the same bubbling oxygen up through that defoaming patch, and then everything would tumble down through the screen. And this was really the mainstay for the next 8 to 10 years, and got so many patients through their procedures. Well, all right, we're going forward on the cardiac side. Now that we have an oxygenator, we can do things. In 1964, two Texans met. Of course, Dr. DeBakey was from this neck of the woods initially, but he moved to Texas, and that was good for politics in the White House. It was also good for politics in the White House that the president was at that time the oldest living male member in his family because all others had died of heart disease. And in fact, 10 years previous to this engagement, Lyndon had had his first heart attack. He was a chain smoker and ultimately would die of a heart attack when he was only 64 years old in 1973. At any rate, he was an easy touch for Dr. DeBakey, who was an artist with his politics, and they established the artificial heart program. It didn't quite look like Hollywood might like us to believe with Pepper and Tony here, but it was a very exciting time, and the public endorsed it. At the time, the death rate from heart disease in the country was remarkably high. Per 100,000, there were over 560 deaths of heart disease. And that's compared today to only 160 in the same 100,000. We've made remarkable progress, but people were dying left and right, mostly from coronary disease at the time. Well, enter Cooley again. And again, these big personalities, they get into it and they lead the way. Artificial heart pump totally replaces heart of man for the first time, 1968. It was almost too bad that the Smothers Brothers had been dropped by CBS that same day. They could have figured their PR a little bit better. They almost got bumped off the front page because of that. That's the Leota heart. It's distinguished for a lot of reasons, but it actually, I think, will be remembered because it had flocked surfaces. These flocked surfaces will reemerge in the LVAD space compared to the smooth surfaces. Those big personalities got into it in Houston, And as you know, Dr. Cooley and Dr. DeBakey had a difference of opinion about how to proceed with this operation. That is the Leota heart. And we should, in a minute, we need some voice. Do you have voice on that, please?
Federal agency or the hospital or something, anybody else, I think I probably would have been denied, and we'd have lost a golden opportunity.
I was in Washington when I read in the morning papers there about the use of this artificial heart that Dr. Cooley had put in a patient. I was shocked. I didn't know that he had done all of this surreptitiously. You see, I didn't know he had taken it from the laboratory.
After the surgery was...
So, let's have one more follow-up now, because we don't hear these things anymore. Can we have volume on this too, please? This movie, and if you could start it for me.
Now, Dr. Cooley had no experience with the artificial heart program at all. Didn't do any laboratory work. He was a good surgeon, but that's all.
Dr. DeBakey seemed to show a little interest in ever using it. Dr. Leota thought he was just wasting his years in the laboratory working with animals and so on, that this would never be tested clinically. And I thought, and agreed with Dr. Leota, the time had come to really give it a test, and the only real test would be to apply it to a dying patient.
Dr. Higgins, I don't know whether we have these kinds of exchanges so much anymore in our meetings, but perhaps we could consider it. Taking a breath away from the dazzling heart surgeons, we get to the calmer artificial respiratory developers, and Ted Colabo was a remarkable individual. He worked without the madness of the bumpers, but Ted worked in earnestness at the NIH in the device section, creating membranes for transferring gases. And he ended up developing the spiral lung, shown here on the left, which was ultimately marketed as the SciMed oxygenator and made everything possible in terms of ECMO. The silastic membrane permitted long-term oxygenation to occur without creating difficulties with the direct surface problems that the bubblers were creating. He's shown here with Warren Zapol in 1968. I visited him, and he made a prediction. He said that we're not going to use ventilators in the ICU anymore. People will just have their blood oxygenated directly. Not sure we're quite there, but we may be getting there soon. Same time frame, Bob Bartlett, who has been a great mentor, was caring for children as a resident at the pediatric hospital in Boston. His chief, Dr. Gross, and he had a conversation because children were dying in the ICU after open heart surgery. They were dying from heart failure and what looked like heart shock. And Bob said, well, what if we kept the hearts on heart-lung machines for a couple of days? Wouldn't those hearts get better? He was reminded by Gross that it's likely that the heart-lung machine was causing the trouble in the first place. But he said, it's an idea, and you should go to the laboratory. Franny Moore, his chief at the Brigham, supported that, and he went into the lab. He was joined by Lou Plazak, who I ran into in medical school at Thomas Jefferson University. They worked on another silastic membrane oxygenator, and they got dogs to live 4 days. This launched Bob Bartlett into his career in UC Irvine, where he, in earnestness, began the laboratory and what we now know as clinical ECMO. Bob hadn't quite completed his preparedness for ECMO, and a patient was referred to him in Santa Barbara who had had a massive car accident and lung failure. This was a new diagnosis back then of ARDS. Patient was sent to Don Hill, who was one of the other few people interested in artificial respiration. And Don Hill, with his colleague Morris Bramson, put this young gentleman on the ECMO system shown there for 3 days, and he survived. Hill had tried other patients, but none had made it. But this was the first adult that did so, and it created quite a stir. This ultimately became, in a very short time, 1974, the NIH trial looking at ECMO compared to conventional ventilation. Those that received ECMO are in the open circle line, and those that received the mechanical ventilation are in dark, and the lines don't distinguish between themselves. Well, we all cry for randomized trials, but let me tell you, this was strange, and it set us back. There were 9 new centers to ECMO. Each center did a couple a year. There were no standards. There were 5 different oxygenators used in the trial. And when it was abruptly stopped, it set back adult ECMO for years. The same thing almost happened in the VAD space with Rematch. Bob stayed on track with a steady tiller. Again, the calmness of the respiratory development. His colleague was operating on a baby with a TGA, and this 5-year-old didn't come off pump very well, and Bob put that baby on ECMO. That baby was the first survival with ECMO from a cardiac case, 1972. A little bit later, there was a baby with meconium aspiration who survives to today. Her name is Esperanza, for hope. She was an adopted child, and given the name of Esperanza because of what she meant in terms of hope with respect to this mechanical device that saved her life. I personally jumped on board in 1978 with that ECMO, and we did ECMO trials at the Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. And, we never looked back, but it was distinctly different than the artificial heart and mechanical heart work. It was calmer. It was very empathetic because you saw patients over days either dying or getting well. The rewards were similar, but the cadence was different, and the personalities were different. Back to the cardiac development now. John Norman, shown here, was attracted from Boston to join Cooley, in part because Cooley was losing Leota, who was going back to Argentina. And John Norman had distinguished himself in the Boston laboratories, and he was interested in the ventricular assist devices, shown here, an intra-abdominally placed LV to aortic anastomosis. And I would say John Norman was the pioneer and the one that knew the most about it. He implanted 22 LVADs and 34 intra-aortic balloon pumps, a rarity then, and everybody died. It seemed like that bumper car had run off the track. We heard Ferraris again, but only got scooters. December 1st, Barney Clark received, in 1982, the total heart, and there's a wonderful picture of Bill DeVries over him. We had hope again. That hope was dashed a little bit, but not before a number of us got involved. And again, that distinguishing sound that I was able to hear was from our involvement in 1985 in Pittsburgh. The enthusiasm didn't last too long, and those individuals interested in the total heart persevered and made some progress. The Jarvik heart moved around a little bit. It's become commercialized and available today, but not overly well used. The Abiomed group with Rob Dowling here today in the audience implanted hearts in Louisville with great success, totally implanted without any external power source. But the success was not enough to sustain the expense, and that project was discontinued. The French heart, Cabrol inspired, is very much like these big hearts, pulsatile. We will learn of other hearts in a few minutes that, again, have promise for the future. But that just leaves us with an EKG and no ventriculogram at all. It's pretty weird to do an EKG on somebody with a total artificial heart, and you get to see nice atrial rhythm. So it wasn't unusual to find these hearts not being used. And in fact, in this appliance and housewares ad, there's a used Jarvik 7 heart, $1,500. Not bad. And the big personalities that were there, Rob Jarvik was one of the biggest. He would go toe-to-toe with Dr. Cooley and now Bud any day because of his personality. And he became, in essence, a centerfold. And one such centerfold was located for this talk. And there's Rob Jarvik as part of a centerfold of one of these, throwaway magazines. This is the inventor of the artificial heart. That, too, doesn't have the same panache now as it used to. So it took the calm William Pierce to bring us back to reality and slow that bumper car down a little bit. He introduced in 1981 the Pierce-Donachie paracorporeal ventricular assist device, and it worked. This device hung outside the body, two big blood hoses, bringing blood to and fro to the heart. But it did work, and we owe Dr. Pierce a huge debt of gratitude. Most patients received one, but other patients who had biventricular failure could have two. About the same time, down the road were coming other devices. There was a univentricular electric device produced by the Novacor company, shown here. And then the TCI device, initially as a pneumatic device, later becoming electrified. They seemed to vie for the paracorporeal device, and they seemed to be winning that war because they could be implanted into the abdominal wall. The patient didn't need this thing hanging outside. And because of the obvious advantage of electrification that the Novacor had, it seemed like it could ultimately be a battery-approached project. So off went the paracorporeal device, leaving us with these two devices. Well, the Novacor device, which was remarkably reliable in terms of its never-failing kind of approach, it always would beat. It was a solenoid with a big spring, and so it was very easy to keep this thing going, and there were very few moving parts. Unfortunately, it had a problem with stroke. It created thromboembolic debris. Our group in Pittsburgh worked hard on the evaluation of the device, and you can see that this is a flow visualization study on the bottom right where the blood that's flowing into the inlet valve just kind of stagnates behind it, and that results in a valve that looks like the picture below it. It had a good central vortex, but it were these nooks and crannies where the problems occurred, and those things chunked off and created strokes at high rates. The outflow grafts also were a problem. The initial Cooley graft, which was Dacron-based, seemed to bake down its thrombus and then flake him to the brain. Improvement occurred, as shown in this slide, with Vastec, but you were still left with about a 15 to 20% stroke rate when you use the left ventricular assist device called the Novacor. Well, we're tolerant of a lot of things in surgery, but we hate strokes, and patients hate strokes. And so the Novacor pretty much lost out. The successor, obviously, was the TCI device, which was ultimately the HeartMate 1. It was remarkable in that it didn't have a smooth surface. It had this textured polyurethane on the movable portions, shown on the upper right, and it had this sintered titanium on the metal. And these surfaces created a fauve natural surface and seemed to cover over nooks and crannies. And this pump, while it had difficulties with its reliability, it didn't create strokes. And in fact, most patients went home off of anticoagulation. A lesson to be learned, for sure. This pump ran electrically, ultimately, on a roller screw concept. And those engineers in the audience will understand this is a pretty unstable deal. And there were a lot of bearings, and these things at times became a problem and broke. But again, reliability was a very different problem than that of a stroke, and this device was preferred. So in the mid-'80s, we're starting to see patients up and around, albeit with these big consoles with nurses and technicians to follow, but it looked like they needed to march off the wards. This guy from New York wanted to go home. Well, he didn't make it home, but this young man made it out of the house, and I was part of an FDA application then to get this young man to a home near the hospital with his whole system. You can see all the engineers with him. And the funny part about it was we went through virtually reams and reams of FDA qualification, and the only thing that came back after we submitted was what happens if the automatic sprinkler goes off in this home. You've told us that there's a sprinkler for fires, and what happens if it goes off and the console gets wet? We spent a long time trying to figure that out, and the engineers were trying to figure out how to create insulations to the panels and the boards. And one surgeon, who's now balding, came up with a crazy idea. We put an umbrella stand on the console, and the FDA bought it. This is Mike Templeton. He was the first patient with a truly electrified heart to get out of the hospital without a console, and he's shown here in 1991, a patient of Bud's. So you can see we're evolving. This then set us up for the rematch. That's Eric Rowe's most quoted reference to the device versus medical therapy, and it was the device that we were just talking about. And you can see the outcome was a close call, certainly at 2 years. One wonders whether a patient here or there could have really sunk this whole thing. It was declared to be a success, but I always wondered. The interpretation was pro-surgical. There were 41 LVAD deaths associated here, meaning the LVAD failed. There were 17 patients that died from sepsis, 7 from the LVAD, 41 overall deaths, 17 from sepsis, 7 from LVADs, 4 from cerebral vascular disease, 2 PEs, and 1 by, again, left ventricular dysfunction, which is hard to understand. The adverse events were 2.3 times as frequent in the LVAD group, so you wonder how in the heck it ever was interpreted by the New England Journal as a pro-LVAD program. Had it not been, I think we would have been sunk, just like the ECMO program was sunk by the trial, and we would have been set way back. But we got a proper, encouraging interpretation. So it was selection early, and then it was the device mid-range that was causing trouble, and then long-term, just things petered out. Another luminary, of course, Norman Shumway. We spent $1 billion on pulsatile pumps up to that point. And Shumway said, if you can't implant a lifetime pump with anticipation of replacing it every 2 years, and he was right. We got to do better. About that time, Rich Wampler, traveling in Egypt, sees a water screw pump, which was used for irrigation. And he had an inspiration. That inspiration was, can we create a little pump that would be continuous flow? And he invented the hemopump. Now, that hemopump went as fast as 30,000 RPMs. 30,000 RPMs. Our VADs now run between 4 and 8. The concern was that this, again, would create a milkshake in the blood. But it was determined later that, in fact, if you regulate the time of exposure to high stress and you limit the high stress to 400, you can get by pretty well. And these pumps worked fine. There was mismanagement of trials, and 3 different companies owned that particular device before it hit the graveyard. But it set a standard for other pumps in the near future. You can see it passed right through the aortic valve. Who would have guessed you could take blood from the left ventricle and pump it up into the aorta? We know now that the current Abiomed Impella pump is modeled directly from this. Well, about this time, we were gearing up our labs, and in fact, more than $40 million has been spent by the NIH to our laboratory to help secure this process. We began developing, on the basis of Bill McGowan gift at the McGowan Center in Pittsburgh, this continuous flow pump, which was imagined by the Nimbus company. That pump ultimately ended up as the HeartMate 2 device, and I had the great pleasure, along with Bob Cormos, of being invited by Vic Poirier, then the head of the HeartMate group, TCI, to go to Israel and implant the device. Shown here at the very first one in July 2000. Well, how have we been doing? If you look at the difference between the rematch down in the bottom left of this slide, we get all the way up with the HeartMate, that's a good device, and then we get to the Intermax rotary pumps. Look at the difference, the jump between 2007 and 12 in terms of outcomes. In 2017, we're still on our way. And if you really look at patients less than 70 years old, renal impairment and shock not present, Back in 2012, we were doing pretty well. But how about today? Today's even better. The results of the recently released Momentum trial using this particular device, which is a HeartMate 3 device, comparing that device to the earlier devices was an interesting exercise because the event-free composite was strongly positive for the newer device. The line above these two lines that are solid would be the lines if you were doing heart transplantation. So mechanical support is not quite there yet, but survival rates are getting better. The whole Intermax group is shown in solid blue just below the Momentum green line. Momentum taught us a few things. They taught us that we're still not there at 5 years, which should be, I think, our goal line. Momentum told us, and actually the Intermax data shown here by Bob Kormos, our honoree of this morning, shows that the big problems in VAD support continue to need to be addressed. Infection, up left, bleeding from AVMs ultimately, and strokes. And they all kind of vie for that 10 to 20%, 30%, 40% likelihood by 2 years. So if you don't deal with this by changing devices or learning how to better manage patients, we're probably not going to make it where we want to go. Well, what about the infection problem? It was in 2000 that Walter Pay introduced the Lionheart built by Arrow, and that was really cool. Everything was implanted, and here's somebody in the year 2000 with an LVAD with a total disconnected power source. Internal power for, I think it was 20 minutes, but he had transcutaneous coupled power, nothing going through the skin. A forerunner of today, and unfortunately, it's taken more than 20 years to get back to it. We're back to it now, and there are a couple of companies which are proposing a fully implanted LVAD, which should deal with the percutaneous infection problem. This particular proposal by Abbott says in the next few years there could be 6 hours of freedom with recharging of their systems using a number of TETS-type non-piercing skin charging systems. Well, we still have pumps to thrombose and we have strokes, but I think it's all because we don't put the pumps in very well. We still use a big, long elephant nose of a inlet cannula, and that gets malpositioned. You can see here in our own program, that upper left clusters in red triangles patients that had pump thromboses who received LVADs compared to the green that didn't. That upper quadrant is also the quadrant where we see that long nose of the inlet cannula sticking in against the left ventricular septum. And when you operate on a patient, and this patient had a heart transplant, but in the nick of time, I'd say, because that patient was about to thrombose their pump, because look at the thrombus associated, and that was one that was sticking right into the septum also. Things change after implant, and sometimes it's hard to redirect these in the proper location. There were no thromboses in patients who had their LV inlets correctly positioned. If you study this, you can see that, it's obvious, just like with the early NovaCore device, if you don't direct inlet in a straight fashion so that it can fill without disturbances along the base or into the septum, you get reduced flow. I like to think that middle one looks like a bathtub drainage. If you build a column at the top of your bathtub drainage plug, you're going to have a lot of stuff around that thing, a lot of hairs and dirt and stuff. But that's why bathtubs don't have rims along their drainage. We should do the same thing in the apex. And in fact, there's a company, the EvaHeart, that is currently in clinical testing the non-elephant trunk inlet, if you wish. And there's an animal study from one of their experiments. But it'd be interesting to see if that can make a difference for us. Certainly something needs to change. The other thing I want to comment on is this whole issue of VADs that don't provide much pulsatility. We learned that continuous flow was good overall, but this lack of pulsatility ain't normal. And it seems these AVMs occur for lots of reasons, von Willebrand's factor that's cleaved, but also this tendency for these AVMs to occur and bleed. That seems to be dependent upon pulseless perfusion because it didn't happen in the other LVADs that were pulsatile. And so those devices in the future that give us a flat HQ curve will be those that will be able to preserve systolic and diastolic pressures as shown in the upper as opposed to the lower device characteristic. One of the more exciting things shown here in a picture with its inventor, Dr. Timms, on the Bivacor total artificial heart, that heart can spin and stop because it's continuous and it's magnetically suspended. So you can start it and stop it without bearing wear, and it can create, in essence, a normal DPDT. I think devices in the future that can do that will eliminate the problems of bleeding that we're terrified over now. Now, a short, quick trip now to finish up on lungs. Wilhelm Kolff, in the early 40s and during the Second World War, in essence, invented dialysis. He used sausage casings to dialyze blood against and treated renal failure. He progressed and used cellophane between blood tubules as part of dialysate, and he noticed if he aerated the dialysate, the blood came out red. And so he had the idea of using thin porous membranes which could transfer gases. And he was the originator of the modern day microporous tubules that we currently use in all of our oxygenators. And he's, like he was with the total artificial heart, an originator now of an ambulatory artificial lung, shown in the early 80s at the Hilton in New York at one of the early OSIO meetings. He's basically demonstrating what then was picked up by industry just a year ago with the LivaNova device on his chest, as this was, 20 years later. But it took originators like Dr. Kolff who quietly just worked it out. That's all morphed to the current Quadrox oxygenator. You can see some of you have these in your ICUs. They've made a huge difference in terms of safe ECMO and prolonging because of the manufacture of these very reliable blood oxygenators. And this system has lots of bells and whistles that can tell you what the pressure is, what's on the menu in the cafeteria, all kinds of things, but the core is the oxygenator that has made such a difference. Okay, so now we have pretty reliable oxygenators. Doesn't require a bedside nurse. Charlie Hoops did his best to take us to the next step, and he showed us that people could actually walk if they were on ECMO using a very specially designed Zwischenberger-type Avalon cannula from the neck where the blood went in and out. He got up and he walked around. This gentleman was not a neophyte to ECMO because this was his second time around. He'd previously had a double lung transplant and now was awaiting a second one. I've been luckily funded by the NIH since 2000 on the problem of chronic artificial lung development. They funded me for over $19 million, and I better come up with something pretty fast. We are closing in on this, and I think that in most people in this audience's lifetime, we will be seeing backpack-supported, if you wish, ECMO at home in patients with paracorporeal devices. I think it's going to be cool. I think we're going to see a lot of compassion, and I think we're also going to learn a lot about lung disease. This is a patient in our center that developed a severe ARDS. You can see that her lung is whited out on the upper left. 118 days later, it's on the mid-upper, and you can see a striking improvement in the CT scan. Now, why this got better, I can't tell you because we've had others similar that did not. But the point is this one did. We can see that ARDS shown here, 118 days of ECMO recovered, but why? We don't know. We need to learn it. But I'm guessing one of the very important parts of getting well is doing no harm. And I think we do a lot of harm sometimes with patients, and I think the lung just needs to sit there and get better. If it doesn't get infected, my prediction is, and it has a platform of recovery with prolonged ECMO that's safe, many patients with ARDS, and there are 250,000 ARDS patients in the US and a 40% mortality rate today. If we can get a number of these patients, the youthful ones, the ones that have lots to live for, on platforms for recovery that they can go home with for up to 6 months, I think a lot of them will get better. Well, who would ever imagine you could go home on ECMO? And Griffith's crazy. Well, they're already doing it. Palmer at Karolinska spoke to us at Maryland about this wonderful case. This young lady shown here being hauled up on her porch 200 kilometers from her hospital in Sweden. Wanted to go home. She'd been on ECMO for 6 weeks. She just wanted to go home and have a supper. They're a very compassionate group. They said, well, sure, you can go home. So they put an ambulance together, and all these people went out with her, and they hauled her up this ramp, which was made for her arrival on the back porch. And now she's home, and she's having a supper, a little pasta supper, as you can see, and a sip of wine. She's with her daughter and her husband, but she's happy. She went home that same day, went back to the hospital the same day. And Pally said, well, I don't know why we didn't keep her there overnight. We just didn't think about it. We had the oxygen. We had the electricity. There was no reason we couldn't have kept her there that night. But they did return home. But I think it says, per principle, we're going home with ECMO, and I hope that the same kind of enthusiasm and compassion that got us to where we are now will continue going forward to be sure this doesn't stop there. So, in conclusion, this whole business of heart and lung development has been a really fun house. It's been crazy. It's been sometimes untethered, sometimes tethered. The personalities have been big. I'm grateful to Bud. Bud's here today. I saw him earlier. Bud, thank you. Bud's always been generous and always been at the forefront. Sometimes he talked about Ferraris that didn't quite make it, but he was always there, and he will be there in the end, I'm sure. And then there's Bob Bartlett, shown here with his wife, Mindy, and one of our faculty members now. And Bob has always been somebody who shared. He didn't understand how not to tell you everything he knew. He's been available day and night, and a mentor since 1977 to me. The guys in Pittsburgh know how I feel about him. This is the McGowan Center that started a lot of mechanical device development for me, and I'm deeply appreciative of my roots and what I've learned. And then, of course, you always have a buddy who comes with you, and John Wu came with me from Pittsburgh and has been the bioengineer who has helped me through all of my device developments and our hopes to make things better. So I hope I haven't gone on too long. Personalities are hard to capture in 45 minutes of this nature. But I hope you got the idea, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Griffith, for an engaging and thought-provoking perspective. Really, we all enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today and this week. We have more interesting sessions on the agenda, so please join us in the exhibit hall one more time before you leave, as it closes today at 1:30. We also want to thank all of you for your participation and joining us here in New Orleans. It really has been a fantastic meeting, and we look forward to great things in the future. Thanks again, and look forward to seeing you next year in Austin, Texas. Congratulations and thanks to all. Have a great day.